Um, Welcome to a special Tisha B'Av edition of Daf Yomi Week in Review. Today, we're taking the review concept, thinking about it a little more broadly in deference to the Jewish calendar, because it is Tisha B'Av, the Jewish national day of mourning and remembering the destruction of the temple and other disasters that have befallen the Jewish people. So if you're a little more tired today, if you're a little more down, that is totally understandable. We're going to just take it at a nice pace. We're joined this morning by Dr. Sarah Ronis, who it turns out that the Daf Yomi calendar is sort of well aligned with Tisha B'Av this year, because there are a lot of stories of destruction in Gittin, and we are going to take this as an opportunity to do some learning sort of that's within the cycle, but also more attuned to the day on the calendar today. So Dr. Otis, I'm going to kick it over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Scheinerman. So I want to start by saying just that because greeting people is a source of joy, of communal simcha, many people have the custom to not say good morning or otherwise greet people on this day. So I want you to know, if you're used to me greeting you, or if you're used to lots of folks greeting you in the chat, it's not personal today if you are feeling less greeted. Tisha B'Av is, as Dr. Scheinerman noted, a Jewish day of mourning. We come together to sit alone, to mourn the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem and other tragedies in Jewish history. The tragedy that is the start of this event, in many ways, occurred in the year 70 CE. And so our plan today is we're going to take this whole hour just to read and discuss how the Talmud in our tractate, Tractate Gittin, reflects on this event. And I think this is particularly powerful for those of us who are not living in Jerusalem in the 1st century CE, which I'm guessing is all of us, because we are not immediate to the event. And the Talmud, the Babylonian Talmud, is also not immediate to this event. It's composed at least 100 to several hundred years later in a completely different place, Babylonia, in a different empire. And what we're seeing as we're going to read these is how people at a distance reflect on the event, and how its memory continues to be meaningful and powerful in different times and places. So for those of us who are doing the daf, we know that the Talmud has a very, very extensive discussion of this. And we cannot read all of it together in any kind of depth. So what I'm hoping we'll do is we'll look at 3 very specific scenes in the Talmud's discussion that I hope will shed different kinds of light on how the rabbis processed this incredibly traumatic event in their history, and what we can take from it. I also want to let you know that these stories in the Bavli are upsetting, and they are meant to be. They discuss murder and suicide, violence against children and animals, sexual violence and exploitation. Today is a sad day. It's supposed to be a sad day, but it's also a day where you are the expert at what you can encounter in a healthy way. So just be aware that these are going to be our topics for this hour. I'm going to share a document with you. So you do not need to follow along in this document, but if you, because I'm going to share my screen, but if you're the kind of person who likes to have it up, or you want to have it saved for later, I think I have just successfully shared a link in the chat. And Dr. Cheyenne, can you let me know if that works?
Yes, it's there.
Okay, great. Now let me share my screen. The lack of breakfast is making me a little slower right now, so thank you all for your patience. Okay, So I want to start with what might be the most sort of classic Talmudic story of the destruction, and that is the story of Kamsa and Bar Kamsa. And because it is a fast day and we have a whole hour, we're going to take this more slowly than usual. We're going to really just read the texts and talk about them together. So that's my hope. Folks who are not pulling it up for themselves, can you see it on my screen?
Please feel free to private message me, anyone who's having trouble, if you can't either see the screen share or open the extra window, and I'll see if I can troubleshoot for you.
Wonderful, thank you. So let's start. I'm going to read in the English, follow along in whichever language speaks to you this morning. Jerusalem was destroyed on account of Kamsa and Bar Kamsa, right? That's the classic statement. And then we get the story about what that means. There was a certain man whose friend was named Kamsa and whose enemy was Bar Kamsa. He made a feast and said to his servant, "Go and bring me Kamsa." The servant went and brought him Bar Kamsa. The host came and found Bar Kamsa sitting at the feast. He said to Bar Kamsa, "That man, i.e. you, is the enemy of that man, i.e. me, right? You're my enemy. What are you doing here? Arise and leave." Bar Kamsa said to him, "Since I have already come, let me stay, and I will give you money for whatever I eat and drink." The host said to him, "No." Bar Kamsa said to him, "I will give you money for half the feast." The host said to him, "No." Bar Kamsa then said to him, "I will give you money for the entire feast." Just like, don't make me leave in the middle in front of everybody. The host said to him, "No." He took Bar Kamsa by his hand, stood him up, and took him out. Bar Kamsa said, now we see there's other people at this feast. Bar Kamsa said, since the sages were sitting there and did not protest, learn from it that they were content with what he did. I will go and inform against them to the king. Okay. What's jumping out at you at this point in the story? And we can either see hands, or if you'd like to put some thoughts in the chat, what are you noticing in this story? So far, I know many of us have learned this and know the end, but so far. Claudette, can we figure out how to unmute Claudette?
There are quite a few things. One, how unforgiving the host was. Two, how humble the Bar Kamsa was because he was begging to stay. And three, the sages that didn't do anything about it. And I think sometimes when we stand by and let evil rise, we are culpable.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you, Claudette. I think, and Erica Goldman Brody in the chat says, right, why does no one come to the guest's defense? And Martha, again, I think points out here that the sages didn't speak up in public or take the host aside. There were so many different ways that the leaders of the community or that other people who were at the event could have intervened in some way and didn't. Wonderful, thank you all. And I see another hand. Leah? Leah, you're still muted.
Okay, now, thank you. It occurs to me as what has already been said, absolutely. It's almost worse when you see something bad happening and you are able to intervene, not intervening. But I'm wondering if Kamsa and Bar Kamsa, if that could possibly be alter egos of the same person. the Yetzer HaTov, the Yetzer Hara fighting, we are sometimes our own worst enemy. And if you see the story allegorically, unfortunately, I am a child of German Regie Theater, so maybe I'm seeing too much into it. But this is when we fight with ourselves and wind up not doing anything, then we open the way for bad things to happen because we have not been able to intervene. And the fact that the sages are sitting there and not protesting, they were content with what he did, and then somebody goes and informs, and we know what happens then. When two people fight, there's a wonderful saying in German: when two people fight, a third one is happy. And I think there's a lot of philosophy in this. There's so much to read into this that is on the periphery of the story that could possibly be an allegory for the way many people have behaved during the Shoah, for how many people have behaved in recent times when refugees come and we turn them away.
Well, and I think what you're pointing out is something that Eric has also noted in the chat. Eric Wasser wrote the bystander effect versus the upstander effect.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Thinking about what it means when maybe you aren't actually happy. Maybe you're really uncomfortable with something that's happening in the room. I've definitely been in that position, but you still, either because you were raised to be non-confrontational, or you're, I don't know, I'm Canadian, we don't like to cause trouble.
From Minnesota, I get it.
right, Midwest nice, which really can allow a lot of conflict. Thank you. I see another hand. I see Barbara, and then I do want to move on. So I'm going to, let's go to Barbara and then Linda, and then we're going to move on.
Hi, so you can hear me, yes?
Yes.
Okay. So I've learned this a million times, many people have. And this is, I think, the first time that it occurs to me not to be so sympathetic to Bar Kamsa. I always used to feel bad for him. He asked so many times, please let me, I'll pay. Now I'm seeing that he could have, if he was really upset, he could have killed Kamsa's, the host, he's unnamed. He could have killed the host's donkey. He could have burnt down his house. He could have who knows what. But to inform against them to the king means he's going to get everybody in trouble, probably including himself, because the Jews are going to be, they're going to pay for this. That was a terrible, terrible thing for him to do. And that makes me wonder, what did he do to the host to make the host so unhappy with him? And did everybody at the party not like him because there's something about him? On the other hand, we don't want to be too unsympathetic because all of this led to where we are today, to the Khurban and to all the troubles that we had throughout our history. So I'm a little bit confused about where to take it and what he was like, and was the host really, and were the rabbis really so wrong? There's a lot of ambiguity, I think, here, a lot that's not clear.
And let me just tease out two things that you just said, Barbara, because I want to make sure everybody sort of followed along. One is the sages here, when the rabbis talk about the sages in the first temple, in the first century, they're talking about their own sort of intellectual ancestors, the rabbis, right? So you were using those terms interchangeably. For the Talmud, the sages are the rabbis. So this is their own prior generations that they're really discussing here. The second thing I just want to highlight that you said is that the Talmud doesn't tell us what the initial conflict was. Perhaps because that's not what's important to them. It doesn't matter how horrible the thing he did was. Or perhaps to require us to sit with that ambiguity in some really troubling ways, right? And I just want to make sure everybody sort of followed those 2 points that were part of what you were saying. All right, let's go to Linda.
So can you hear me now?
Yes.
So we have talked about this at length, especially in the current situation. But it's just struck me today, why do they both have the same name, but one is the son of Hamza? And wondering if this is also allegorically what happens within the family, within the community, and how much more devastating it is to have internal strife and internal enemies. And I think a lot of us know that there are arguments within families that go for years that are never resolved, and the rest of the family just doesn't know what to do.
Yes, right. And I think, what is particularly striking that I think you're noting here, Linda, and I'm seeing some other folks note in the chat, is that the names are so similar. And I want to, maybe this is a good time to segue just for a minute, because there is something a little strange, because the first line of this story is Jerusalem was destroyed on account of Kamsa and Bar Kamsa. And let's be very clear, Kamsa doesn't seem to do anything. Kamsa's not even invited. He's not at the party, right? This should be, first of all, if we were telling this story ourselves, we might want to make sure we have the host's name because he seems like he's a big part of the problem. And we would say Jerusalem was destroyed on account of whoever that host is and Bar Kamsa, right? Why does the story start by saying that it was destroyed on account of Kamsa and Bar Kamsa? And here, I want us, if you're following along in the source sheet yourself, you can go to number 2. I'm pulling it up here. And Rabbi Yehuda Amital, who was one of the rabbis at yeshiva, at the yeshiva at Gush Etzion, has since passed away. This is a piece he wrote that I read years ago and has really stuck with me, so I wanted to share it with you. He wrote, "The Gemara states that Kamsa's friend made a party. This wasn't a wedding or some other festivity of religious significance. It was a party for an enclosed, self-contained clique, characteristic of a splintered society. This group, to which Kamsa belongs and from which Bar Kamsa was publicly rejected, resembles an egruf kamutz," right? He's making a play on Kamsa kamutz, a closed fist, which safely protects everyone within, but which is impossible to penetrate or to gain entry into. Indeed, this was the sin of Kamsa, his very membership in such an exclusive clique. So Rav Amital is suggesting here, and I think this is something really worth us thinking about, is that the sin is one of Kamsa and Bar Kamsa, both somebody who is excluded and turns to violence, and the very nature of being in the kinds of groups that are exclusive without opportunities to join. And this, to me, I read this years ago, and I've really been sitting with it since, as someone who both appreciates affinity groups, right? Groups of people who are interested in the same things that I am, and as someone who wants to be in a world where people can join and didn't and maybe can't. And Rob points out, I want to be very clear, and I think this is such an important point, and we're going to see this throughout, right? Rob wrote in the chat, "This story is framed as an example of internal infighting as the prime cause of the temple's destruction. It's a blame the victim mentality. Some believe the prime cause of the destruction, I think you mean here of the first temple were the Babylonians, right? So for the second temple, it would be the Romans, a view which is more consistent with our modern sense of assigning responsibility for criminal actions to criminals." Yes, I think we can absolutely say, like, let us be very clear. Correct. Who destroyed the temple? The Romans. Who destroyed the temple? The Babylonians. But I also think that means we have less to learn from it, right? The rabbis who are telling the story of Kamsa and Bar Kamsa, this story is probably written 300 or 400 years later after the destruction and in a different place. What can you learn if we can just say, well, curse those Romans and move on? But if today is an invitation to think about our own complicity, how we can take this sadness and make the world a better place, that doesn't do it. And so I both recognize we don't want to be blaming the victims, and noting how for the rabbis there is a productive power in thinking about where we could do better. And I want to also just note a piece that Bruce Wilkenfeld wrote in the chat. If membership is the sin, Kamsa is no more guilty than any other member. So it's still questionable for him to be singled out. And I think you're absolutely right. And also, if we're saying that everyone who was part of the group, if Rav Amital is saying, and he is, if you read the rest of the piece, that the folks who were part of the group are complicit, let's notice who else is in the group, right? Bar Kamsa said, since the sages were sitting there and did not protest, learn from it that they were content with what he did, right? What does it mean when our leaders are part of exclusive groups? Right. I think there's a lot in this story, and the story continues with a narrative in which Bar Kamsa then essentially engineers a Roman attack on Jerusalem. That part of the story I want to skip just because we have an hour, but time is precious, and so let's move on to a different scene, because that's really the piece I think we can take from this, is to think about our own social configurations. Where are we unnecessarily exclusive? Where are we in terms of leaders who stand up and do the right thing? And what do we do when we feel, right? To go back to, I think, Barbara's really important critique that Bar Kamsa could have done all kinds of other things, right? Where are we when we feel hurt? What are our responses, right? I think all of those sort of are invited by that story. Okay, let's move forward. And now we're at a scene where the temple has fallen, and Titus, who is the general leading the attack at this time, is entering victorious. Okay, and he shall say, we're on source 3 for those who are following along in your own on your own computer. Where is their God, their rock in whom they trusted? This is the wicked Titus, who insulted and blasphemed God on high. What did Titus do? He took a zonah with his hand and entered the Holy of Holies with her. And I'm leaving zonah untranslated for now. So if that's not a term you're familiar with, it is a woman. We'll talk about what kind. He then spread out a Torah scroll and committed a sin with her on it. Afterward, he took a sword and cut into the curtain, and a miracle was performed and blood spurted forth. He thought, Titus, that he had killed himself. I put the himself in capital just as a sign. The Talmud means Titus thought he had killed God. As it is stated, your enemies roar in the midst of your meeting place. They have set up their own signs for signs. Abba Hanan said, the verse states, who is strong like you, O Lord? Who is strong and endureth like you, as you hear the abuse of that wicked man and remain silent? Similarly, the school of Rabbi Yishmael taught that the verse, who is like you, O Lord, among the gods, should really be read, who is like you among the mute, a play here on Elim and Elim. Right, so hearing with, right, so noting God's silence in the face of this event. What else did Titus do? He took the curtain and formed it like a large basket and brought all of the sacred vessels of the temple and placed them in it. And he put them on a ship to go and be praised in his city. As it is stated, and so I saw the wicked buried and come to their rest. But those who had done right were gone from the holy place and were forgotten in the city. Do not read as the wicked buried, kvurim, rather read it as collected, kvutzim. And do not read the word as and were forgotten, rather read it as they were praised, right? Which would mean I saw the wicked collecting and come to their rest. And I saw, and they that had done right were gone from the holy place and were praised in the city, right? Meaning the Romans came and saw all of the stuff and praised it. That's how the Talmud is reading that verse. There are those who say it is actually referring to the buried. Even items that had been buried to hide from the Romans, for example, were revealed to them and they took everything. Okay. So here we're getting a scene of Titus's attacks upon God, the temple, and the temple vessels. And the story shifts then. The part I didn't bring is an elaborate revenge fantasy, thinking about how God eventually punishes Titus with a painful and ultimately fatal punishment. But I want to stop and think with you here about the scenes for which Titus ultimately deserves divine revenge. Right? This is the scene where he does the thing that is worthy of divine revenge. And I want to start by asking the same question I asked before, which is what jumps out at you from this story? Anything? So Julie points out God is depicted as silent, much as we say about the Shoah. And I think we see that particularly in this section that I just highlighted. You know, it's an interesting thing. God's silence, are we supposed to appreciate it or critique it here? What do you think the rabbis think of God's silence? Leah, I'm going to come to you, but I first want to make sure we're talking about the silence piece. What do the rabbis think about silence? I'm so sorry. We're getting the mail right now, so the dog is defending us. So
We can't hear your dog bark because Zoom edits it out.
So I think we're seeing in the chat sort of two different things, right? One is the rabbis seem to feel like it is justified and praised. And the second is it jumps out at us as not necessarily the response we would want. Interesting. All right, Leah. Leah, you are muted. There we go.
I just unmuted. I was going to point that out, but also we realize this is also, we have a Michamocha Ba'elim Adonai. This is, Ba'elim should be telling us, this is another polemic. Hashem is strong enough to deal with the people who have other gods and do not recognize our monotheistic way. And what Titus did was actually a blatant act of defiance. You know, I'm thinking of the story of Hanukkah. Also, it is to do 180 degrees differently from what people are supposed to do, what we are supposed to do. But it's very interesting. Do not read as buried, but read it as collected. And these are all things I say, okay, Titus was punished because his deeds were collected by Hashem. He might not have known, as somebody said, that this was why he ended up suffering. But it's a what goes around comes around situation. And it's a battle, again, of one form of worship against another form of worship, set in a very, very dramatic situation.
Yeah, thank you. Robert, can we ask Robert to unmute?
Yeah. What struck me is that in these different situations, there's lessons that humans can learn, and by God staying silent in these situations, such as Shoah, such as these that are so inexplicable and difficult. But this is where we have the opportunity to learn and assert whatever free will we have. And so, but if God intervenes, then we're not going to learn those lessons. If it's going to be always taking care of us. So that element of the narrative. So there's a benefit, as painful and inexplicable as it is, when God is silent. And but I don't pretend to have the answer, but that's what comes to mind.
Thank you. Right, and I think what both Robert and Leah are pointing out is the ultimate ways that this story can teach us about how the rabbis understand who God is and how God acts in a world where not everybody is aligned with the values that are communicated in sort of the rabbinic tradition, right? And that's a real challenge. I saw in the chat, Linda commented on the means of desecration. Right, the means of desecration, and I want to here just highlight for us the sexual parts of this story. So, and here I mean the obvious sexual parts, right? A zonah is a woman, and so he is literally performing a sex act on a Torah scroll in the Holy of Holies. But I also think we see lots of other metaphors around sex here. The ways that Titus penetrates first the Holy of Holies, and then takes his sword and stabs it into the curtain. Right, there's a lot of really violent sexual imagery in this story, and for those who know the end, which I did not bring here, it is the story ends with Titus himself having his body penetrated by an extremely large something in his head. So I think there is that piece of it here, and I think we're right to be focusing on the big theological questions that this story raises for us. But in the lead up to Tisha B'Av, I've been reading a book by Rabbi Dr. Julia Watts-Belzer called Rabbinic Tales of Destruction, Gender, Sex, and Disability in the Ruins of Jerusalem, which I both think is just a beautiful book and has really made me look at some of these stories in a different way. So I wanted to share what Dr. Watts-Belzer points out about this story, about the piece that I didn't notice the many times I've read this before. And she writes the following. Following the counsel of feminist critic Trin T. Minha to pause and look more closely than is required, to look at what one is not supposed to look at, I want to turn our attention more closely to the woman in this tale. The text describes her as a zonah, a word which rabbinic texts commonly use to describe a woman who engages in lewd or illicit sexual acts, which in Hebrew is znut. In rabbinic culture, both men and women are stigmatized for engaging in znut, right? And I think many of you are noticing this in the parallels that you're making with the Pinchas story. But the word zonah is specifically applied to women. The Bavli has no equivalent terminology that characterizes a man as a fornicator. In rabbinic contexts, we cannot assume that a woman categorized as a zonah worked in the sex trade. As Christine Hayes has demonstrated, rabbinic texts use znut to describe any kind of sexual intercourse that does not result in a valid marriage. The Bavli's terminology of znut is also unconcerned with issues of women's consent. It does not matter from a halachic standpoint in the Talmud whether illicit sex is forced or consensual. Rabbinic legal thought characterizes a Jewish woman as a zonah after sexual intercourse with a person she is not permitted to marry. While the Bavli's audience is expected to regard the woman as essentially identified with and stigmatized by illicit sex, the text offers no insight into her prior sexual history. The term zonah elides two possibilities. If the woman had previously worked as a prostitute, she might have been particularly vulnerable to sexual violence and unprotected by cultural norms that might more successfully shield an elite rabbinic woman. The other possibility is that the woman's status as zonah was forged through rape. A woman without a prior history of sex work could become a zonah on account of Titus's seizure. If so, an uncritical translation of zonah as prostitute effaces this act of brutality and identifies the woman solely in terms of her forced involvement in sexual sin. By characterizing her as a zonah, Bavli Gitin draws attention away from her suffering, de-emphasizing her status as Titus's victim and highlighting her active involvement in the temple's desecration. While the rabbinic tale uses rape to express the rabbi's own symbolic violation at the hands of Rome, and to lament the violation of God through the penetration of the sanctuary, rabbinic discourse forges no empathy with the violated woman. Her body figures in this tale as a marker of the nation's vulnerability, an instrument of the temple's ruin. When I read this, I was genuinely, I felt real shame. Because as often as I have read this story, and I think I am probably in the same camp as Barbara, who earlier said, she had read some of these stories, many, many, many times before, I have never stopped to think about the fact that there are two people in this story, that there is Titus, and that he takes a zonah and does a specific thing with her in the temple on a Torah scroll. But in many ways, she is the first victim of this, right? Who would this woman be in Jerusalem? Right? Who would this woman be? And to me, what that really highlights, and a piece that I think has real relevance today, is that destruction and war and violence affect everyone, but not in the same way, right? People who were already vulnerable in society for other reasons are often hit in different ways, sometimes in harder ways, and we just don't notice, right? Who should we be paying attention to? Who aren't we looking at but need to be? Who is the storyteller in this case not really talking about, but who deserves our attention? And then I think the sort of broader question, which certainly we can all take today, is what does it mean to respond to trauma and disaster sensitive to the fact that different people experience it in disproportionate ways, right? What does that actually look like? I see some hands, and I'd love to get some responses and reactions. So let's start with Linda, and then I'll move to the chat.
So I also think that it's interesting that there's a tradition of temple prostitutes, as we call them, in other cultures that do not worship our God. And so this is not just an act of rape and horror, but it is also an act that is anti our monotheism very dramatically. And I think it's very significant that while God doesn't speak, when he stabs the cloth, it is a miracle that the blood gushes forth. So the people watching this are in horror of what he's doing and maybe in horror of the blood, but they don't act. So perhaps part of it is when you see horrible things happening, what's your role? Of course, they're pretty powerless, but still.
Yeah, I mean, I think that connects us back to the earlier story. You know, now that we're talking about this, I'm seeing in the chat so many people are saying, "Oh yes, here's all of this language that points to this being non-consensual, that points to this being rape," and I think absolutely right. The minute I read this, you know, those times when you read something that's so obvious that you're like, "How on earth did I never see that?" But to me, what you're all noticing is absolutely there. It's just I had never paid attention, and that's a challenge. And while it is certainly true that there are many scholars who would argue that sex work was part of divine worship for lots of religions in late antiquity or in the ancient world, we don't have evidence that would have been an important part of or present in the temple. And I think, you know, here Robert sort of brings us back to the other story as well. She's not in the clique, right? And she's still affected by the destruction. And I would argue, you know, in some ways affected more personally in her body than other people. Yeah. Okay, I am just looking through quickly. All right, wonderful. Claudette, I see your hand.
This whole imagery takes me back to the story of Pinchas. I think it is also saying that it's where we, the Jewish people, were at the time, because what we were doing, that we were so kind of corrupt that this imagery that Pinchas, because if you remember in the story of Pinchas, the people of Israel were behaving badly. So this whole imagery takes me back to that story, and it also questions what were we doing to have this happen to us.
Absolutely. And I think that parallel there, we actually have some really important parallels. First of all, in the story of Pinchas, which is in the book of Numbers, in the biblical book of Numbers, Moses is silent. Moses is silent. And Pinchas, for whom the story is usually named, Pinchas takes action in some ways on his own in the face of the silence of leadership. And that action is itself violent and sexualized. But I think we see there too some real questions around leadership. The other thing that I will say about the Pinchas story is it certainly sounds there like the men and women who are involved in the sexual sin are doing so consensually. Whereas here, I think what Rabbi Dr. Watts-Belzer is pointing out is that we actually don't get that at all. And partially, I think we don't get that because that's not the part of the story that the storytellers are interested in. But I think it invites us or forces us, spurs us to really reflect on who even our narratives of destruction might be obscuring. And in our last 13 minutes, I want to shift now to a different story. This is the third scene that I think we should be looking at. And here, what I think I'm going to do in the interest of time is not actually read the story with you, but just sort of summarize what is happening. This is the story of the woman and her 7 sons. The woman and her 7 sons. They bring in, right, so the emperor in this story brings each of the sons into his court in turn and demands that they worship Roman gods. And each of the sons insists that they will not worship foreign gods because a verse in the Torah, or because God requires monotheism. And each of the sons in turn is taken out and executed. And then they get the last son, and they say to him, worship the idol. And he says, no, excuse me. And the emperor here, I think we're supposed to get the sense where he's sort of worried that his authority isn't being presented well. He says, listen, I will throw down my seal and just bend over and pick it up. People will say that you've bowed down to the idol, but you really won't. And the boy's response is, here in the part that I've highlighted, woe to you, Caesar, woe to you. If you think that for the sake of your honor, I should fulfill your command and do this, then for the sake of the honor of the Holy One, blessed be he, all the more so should I fulfill his command of not worshiping foreign gods. Now the story was called, the story is introduced as saying the mother and her 7 sons. So now we're going to shift to the mother. As they were taking him out to be killed, his mother said to them, give him to me so that I may give him a small kiss. She said to him, my son, go and say to your father Abraham, you bound 1 altar, here the binding of Isaac, but I bound 7. She too went up to the roof, fell, and died. A divine voice emerged and said, joyful mother of children. Okay. So this is a story which, unlike the first 2 that we looked at, this story actually has a lot of parallels in rabbinic literature. The first or the earliest version of this story that we have appears in a book that didn't make it into Tanakh, the book of 2nd Maccabees, which is a book of the external books or the Apocrypha. And Dr. Malka Simkovich has noted that in 2nd Maccabees, the woman makes this elaborate speech where she says essentially that she is confident that she will meet all of her sons in the afterlife. Right? She believes in the resurrection and they are dying now, but they will all be together later. And that speech, you'll notice, is not in this version of the story. This story also appears in a different midrashic text from the land of Israel, a text called Eicha Rabbah, or Lamentations Rabbah. And there, this mother is far more central to the story. In fact, she gets a name. She's named in Eicha Rabbah, in Lamentations Rabbah, Miriam, daughter of Tanchum. And in that story as well, we get a stronger sense of their deaths are a way to resist oppression and are ultimately triumphant because of the afterlife. And what is striking in the version in the Bavli, which is the version which is from the people who are not living in the place where this story is happening, is that we don't get that triumphant version. We don't get discussions of the afterlife and they will all be together at the same time. We get this one line at the end: a divine voice emerged and said, a joyful mother of children. But, and John points out, the mother is joyful perhaps because she will be joining her sons in heaven. But what's striking is the text doesn't say that. And it does say that in the other versions. So again here, you know, as I was reading Dr. Watts-Belzer, she pointed this out. And I will read it here again. This is source 6 in your handout. Bavli Gittin's narrative is not particularly interested in affirming the power of God, nor even in promising Caesar's comeuppance. Gittin's account of the mother and 7 sons draws its readers towards a different emotional reality. This is a narrative that insists upon laying slaughter upon slaughter, that draws its final moral thrust from the mother's 7-fold loss. We are meant to hear over and over again the intertwined refrains: they brought the next, and then they led him away and killed him. The narrative gives us no pause, offers no quarter. Death follows death, with each son persisting in his fidelity to God and Torah. In the repetitive, stylized language of the tale, death becomes routine. None of the characters acquires a name. Even the 7th son, on whom Lamentations Rabbah lavishes such detail, stands for but a bare moment before Caesar's throne. The story reads as a confirmation of brutality, a skeletal coda, a sketch of a tale so well known that it barely needs to be told. So I think this text is, of all of the texts, in some ways, this text is the hardest one for me. And I mean that because, essentially, I'm going to stop sharing so I can see more of your faces. I mean that because I'm a person who wants to take an important message from things. I want to be inspired. I want to be spurred to action. I want to believe that things have a reason and that we can learn something from it. And I think what Dr. Watts-Belzer is pointing out, and I think what the Talmud's version is pointing out, is that they're actually not interested in doing any of that with this story. That actually, you know, my instinct to see a silver lining to everything is not what this story is asking for. It's asking us to just sit in the sadness, right? Not to pivot to a discussion of divine justice in a future messianic era, which I think so many of us would really like to do, but just to sit with the sadness of this loss, of all of these losses, and to take the time to say, I'm not going to, you know, for a moment, for an hour, for for one day on the Jewish calendar, I'm just going to sit with the sadness. And so we have 5 minutes left, and I think, you know, I'm seeing a lot of folks in the chat saying there's a lot we can learn from this. There's a lot we can learn from this, and I think that's true. There's a lot we can learn. There's a lot we need to do reading these stories, thinking about how our own worlds align or don't align with brokenness or wholeness. But I also think, you know, we often talk about Judaism as an intellectual religion, and it is, and I love that. But I think this story and today, Tisha B'Av, really also require us to have a day of feelings, to sit with feelings of sadness and pain, and not insist that we move right away to the triumph, the redemption, the ultimate comeuppance of Titus, but to take the time to actually sit with those feelings. And so I want to just end our discussion by saying that may we be able to take some time today to sit with sadness, to reflect on our own communities, to pay attention to those who we don't often see, and to sit with the feelings of sorrow that emerge. Not so that we can be forever paralyzed by the overwhelming tragedy, but so that tomorrow we can begin to do that work of healing, of making the world and our specific communities a better place. But we need to take the time first to really mourn what is lost before we do that work. And I think Tisha B'Av is certainly the day that Jewish tradition has set aside for those feelings. So that is the end of our discussion. Thank you all for joining us on this morning or afternoon. If there are any follow-up questions, we have a couple of minutes.
Thank you for that last point, especially. I feel like, especially in this culture, we are so in a move forward and fix it mindset so often that taking a moment to sit with feelings is not unpleasant feelings is not necessarily something that's encouraged in the contemporary culture. And I guess something we can appreciate about our tradition, that it gives space for that. 364 days a year are perhaps about action, but one is about, I don't know if indulge is the right word, but taking time with those feelings.
And I also want to say, right, I mean, I think that the Talmud is not, right, and our tradition in general is powerful, and is also very sensitive to the people's individual needs. So sitting with sadness, right, folks who are experiencing depression and anxiety, folks who are experiencing other kinds of mourning, this might not be healthy for you. And there is room in Jewish tradition to engage with the day in a different way. But for those for whom this is healthy, I think our society depicts it as unhealthy, but there is something really healthy in experiencing that sadness and sitting with it for at least some period of time. And maybe only for some period of time, right? And then moving on.
And then the sun goes down. All right. I hope you can see all the comments of appreciation that are rolling in.
Thank you all.
This is not an easy morning, not an easy day, and we appreciate that you were on in a fasted state to take some time and brought these really interesting observations and meaningful sources for us. Thank you all for being here. I'm wishing you all a meaningful Tisha B'Av. May you experience this day in a way that is productive and healthy for you. And we will see you in your inbox tomorrow. And we will be back for a regularly scheduled Daf Yomi Week in Review next week. So thank you, everybody. Take care.